50 years ago, certainly in polite company, sex was a taboo topic. Today, we live in a world where porn is available online 24/7, and swipe left technology has transformed dating culture. A revolution, if you will. But according to Christine Emba's new book, it hasn't delivered better, just more. The book is called Rethinking Sex, a Provocation. Christine Emba is a columnist with the Washington Post, and she joins us now from the U.S. Capitol. Hi, Christine.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show. So, I think it's safe to assume that at no point in the past have so many women been as free to pursue their sexual pleasures as they do, say, in places like Washington or even here in Toronto. Yet, when I first started reading this book, I was kind of a little defensive. And you actually admit in the book towards the end, that quote, that this book was an uncomfortable book to write. If we're so free, why do we still get defensive or uncomfortable when talking about sex?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're totally right that we are, at least supposedly, at an era of kind of almost total sexual freedom, unlike anything maybe our ancestors might have experienced. Um, you know, Contraception is widespread. The social acceptance of extramarital sex is at an all-time high. There's less pressure to need to get married or even be in a relationship to be seen as an adult person. And sexual content is everywhere in media. So why exactly aren't we satisfied is the question. Reports show that despite all of this supposed opportunity, young people especially are having less sex than ever. And I think there are a couple of things that go into sort of this mismatch and also our discomfort, including my own discomfort with talking about it sometimes. One of the big factors, I believe, is that, in fact, because of the accessibility of sex and the way that our culture has sort of connected the idea of sexual liberation to sort of personal liberation, it almost feels like we should be having more sex than we are, even if we don't necessarily want to be. In many cases, feminism has been sort of misconstrued as just sexual liberation. I think a lot of young women feel that, well, to be an empowered modern woman, I should be out there having as much sex as possible, having sex like the guys do. And to admit that that's not satisfying raises some questions of self-doubt. Is there something wrong with me that I'm not liking this as much as I've been told I should? Does it make me a bad feminist or a bad modern to admit that I want something different?
And you kind of touch in the book about this chill culture where when you do meet people, no one really wants to feel or seem committed to pursuing the other person. So what is wrong with the ways that we are having sex nowadays that led you to want to rethink about sex?
Yeah, so, I, I didn't really go into this planning to write a book about sex, but I'm a journalist and an opinion columnist at the Washington Post, and I spend a lot of time writing about ideas in society, ethics, the way that we relate to each other. And in 2018, at the sort of peak of the Me Too moment, I was writing a lot about sort of those developments. And it seemed obvious to me at that point that the problems that we thought had gone away when it comes to sex hadn't, actually. And in fact, the rules were perhaps less clear now than they ever had been. It was kind of hard for women in conversation to draw sort of a clear line. While there were some obvious cases where we knew what had gone wrong, Harvey Weinstein, you cannot, in fact, drag starlets into your bedroom and sexually assault them. The cases that had the most discussion were the ones with gray areas, where mostly, cis, straight women were ending up having sex that they didn't want to have, that they didn't enjoy, that left them feeling disappointed or even mildly traumatized afterwards. And unfortunately, consent, which we talk about a lot, was not enough to prevent this from happening.
I hear that. I hear that, and I kind of, I think maybe that's one of the things that was making me a bit defensive, because when we talk about consent, it feels incredible that we're at a time in history where we're talking about consent. When I grew up, there was no such thing. It was kind of like we followed what if we're in a heterosexual relationship, what the guy wanted. So why is consent not enough?
Yeah, it feels like we should be almost past this. And yes, consent is not enough. I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that consent is incredibly important. And sort of as you said, we've come a long way in just being able to get to the place where we can say no means no. In fact, only yes means yes. We have to get consent before, a sexual encounter for it to be at least legally acceptable. But legally acceptable is a really low bar. I think for most people, we want more from our sexual encounters than for them to be not criminal acts of sexual assault. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard. The question is, what should that standard be? And I would suggest that while consent is a great bar for determining what's, not acceptable at all, we need to be asking ourselves more than, what's legal, and more about what is actually good. What does a good sexual encounter look like? And that would involve thinking about what is good for our partners and for society at large, not just ourselves in that moment.
In the book, you say it's not just about the law. It should be more of an ethical question. You write that, quote, consent is meant to separate criminal sex from non-criminal sex and sexual assault from everything else, but consent doesn't address the gravity of what sex is or how it affects us. For some, having sex is just a physical act, full stop. How can bad sex impact us to what you describe as, quote, the precise depths that sex reaches within us?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I would talk to both women and men for this book, one of the first questions I would ask in interviews is, okay, well, what does sex mean to you? What do you want from sex? And most people would not, in fact, just say, oh, it's like a physical thing. I do it. I don't really care about it. It's pleasurable. They would talk about sort of intimacy, connection, some sort of deep feeling. And when I would ask people what an ideal sexual encounter would be, whether, they wanted to have sort of casual, meaningless sex, most people said, no, not really. Like, that's not my ideal. But would always follow up with, of course, some people want that, though, and we can't judge them. And I think that's fair. But it was interesting to note that it was always someone else who was saying that. Very few, in fact, none of the people I spoke to said that that's what they wanted for themselves. And yet they sort of felt almost pressured to either act like they did or acknowledge it.
Do you think that people are being coerced in a way in just having sex because we should be having sex because those are the expectations that everybody else has?
I do think that there is something about our social expectations that's pushing people to do things that maybe they aren't fully comfortable with or, wouldn't necessarily choose for themselves. So you asked a bit earlier, and sorry, I kind of moved past this, about the idea of sort of this casualness, pretending not to care and not to want commitment. And in our modern society, there's a real emphasis on sort of the individual. We kind of reify the idea of our freedom and suggest that to each other. And, society's messages are around this, that freedom looks like not being connected to anyone else, not having to care about anyone else, moving on as soon as possible, acquiring sexual experiences for the sake of the experience, not necessarily the other person. And you see that in the shows we watch and in the books we read. Sex and the City was one of the texts, as it were, that so many people I interviewed cited. And, it's a show about women sort of getting together and talking about the one-off sexual encounters that they had, making jokes and not caring about the other person. And because that message is sort of so pervasive, people feel like, well, to be a modern feminist, what I'm hearing is I should do the same thing. Commitment is lame. To be cool, I need to be chill and not have feelings.
I want to come back to casual sex in a minute, but I want to talk about you for a second because you share some personal details in the book about yourself. Your story begins with you being raised by Nigerian immigrant parents who were evangelical Christians. In time, you became a Catholic. To what extent is what you're reacting to and against is due to your upbringing?
That is a great and kind of complicated question. One of the things that was interesting about writing this book, and I think that led me to write the book, was that as I moved through sort of growing up with my parents in this tradition and exploring sort of faith and spirituality and how I wanted to be an adult for myself, I personally felt pushed to reconsider a lot of my beliefs and my understandings of what sex looked like and what it should be, comparing sort of what I was told I should do to what I saw the people around me experiencing and what I felt when I had experiences. And in writing this book, I was, of course, influenced by my, religious faith and background, but I also wanted to sort of write and think about things in a way that would be accessible to anyone, whether secular or religious. And in some ways, I feel like I had an interesting and unique and kind of lucky vantage point in that because of my religious upbringing, I spent a long time sort of not totally involved in this scene, but being able to observe from sort of outside of the, post-virginal circle, as I put it in my book, and then inside. And what I saw my friends and loved ones experiencing, what I talked about with people, showed me that, what was being promised by our sexual culture, what people thought and hoped they would get, was not always matching up with what they experienced.
That's interesting when you said it wasn't matching, because I remember when I was in my teens, there was kind of like this movement within my friend circle, the first person to lose their virginity. And then the older you get, it becomes kind of like taboo to admit that you're a virgin. You lost your virginity in your 20s. Do you regret waiting?
I actually don't. I think that waiting gave me a chance to, again, really think about what I wanted from sex and who I wanted to be as a person before sort of stumbling into things unaware. So I guess I had more almost mental and emotional preparatory time. I do think, though, and I wrote about this in the book, there's a section that talks about this, there is sort of a stigma to waiting. And again, it comes with sort of these cultural ideas we have about tying sex to adulthood or tying sex to experience or, being a feminist or a modern young person. In some ways, if you're not part of the sexual culture, however unsatisfying it may be, you can still feel like you're being left behind.
Which is interesting, because if we're free to do what we want to do, we should also be free to choose to not participate.
Right, exactly. And I think that this is one of the promises that's sort of worth prodding at in the book, and that's kind of why I call it a provocation. We are told sort of that sexual freedom, sexual liberation is great, and we should be able to go out and do whatever we want with anyone we want, sort of whenever we want to. But that messaging almost seems to be that we should be doing that. Sex positivity has gone from, be free to explore your sexuality to be out there exploring it all the time if you want to be a good feminist. And it doesn't really feel like freedom. If in the past, sort of we were burdened by strictures of you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be having sex, you shouldn't be talking about it, for many young women especially, but also men, it now feels like there's pressure in the opposite direction. You should be doing this, you should be out there. And that's not really freedom either.
Which leads us to this conversation around dating, because presumably before you have sex, you date. We have some stats on how much harder dating has become over the last decade alone. Nearly half of U.S. adults, 47%, said dating is harder today for most people compared with 10 years ago, while a third say it is about the same, and 19% say it's easier today. Women are much more likely than men to say dating has gotten harder, at 55% versus 39%. Black women say 62% are more likely than Hispanic women at 50% to say dating has gotten harder, while 55% of white women say the same. Women find dating more difficult today than 10 years ago, which is kind of shocking to me, because you're assuming that dating apps should offer women the opportunity to maybe vet men they're going to meet, hopefully making it a safer and better experience. But why is it harder?
One of the first things I noticed in your relaying these statistics is the idea that, presumably you date before you have sex, which is Not always what happens these days. But yeah, I think these statistics are exactly right. And, you're giving them out also this month, which is the 10th anniversary of Tinder, the dating app being launched and sort of launching a revolution in the way that we date and meet people. And I think that dating apps in general have really changed the culture of dating. If in the past you might meet someone through friends or, your workplace or a church or some other association, now you just sort of meet them through a swipeable act or a swipeable app. Meeting someone through your community means that there is usually at some level some accountability. You have sort of some background on the person. That person knows that you know who they are and are connected to their peers. And so in some ways there's sort of a barrier, some accountability. People are less likely to act like their worst selves, to send pictures of their genitals or ghost you if they know that it might get back to their community. But on dating apps, of course, there's not that level of accountability. You're sort of meeting in an enclosed and private space where anything could happen and nobody would know. And while that feels freeing, it can be really alienating at the same time.
In what ways? Because I think before, when you'd go on a date, it felt like as if you're getting references from your friends, like that's a good guy. But when you're online, you don't really get to know these people that well. It's just kind of like they present their best foot forward.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's something about, the way that dating apps are created and set up. Most of these apps are sort of set up in this kind of card deck format, right? Where you swipe through people left and right, and there's almost an ongoing chain of potential dates. And again, this seems really freeing. Like now we have options. It's not just who you might run into at the corner store. But at the same time, that has changed the dating mindset for a lot of people, and both men and women feel this. It feels a bit more consumerist, right? Like you're shopping for a person. One woman I interviewed, sort of bragged to me about how she ordered a guy off Tinder and then later said, she realized that made it sound like she was ordering a pizza, and maybe that's not how she should talk about a real person. But because of this sort of sense of disposability, often people don't treat the people they're on a date with as a full human being, and that can be really painful.
I'm glad that you used that word painful because that example you just used of this person is an object instead of a person with feelings. You write that casual sex in particular disadvantages women. What do you mean by that? Because I think some people might hear that and maybe assume that you're being judgmental.
Yeah, this is this is one of the sections in the book that I also thought would be a provocation, and it turns out it was. But I think that if we want to improve our sexual culture, make it better for all of us, we have to be honest about what sex really looks like. And, I suggest that especially if we're talking about heterosexual dating, men and women come to sort of the dating playing field with different vulnerabilities and, different ways of being. Women can get pregnant generally, and men do not. And that's sort of a burden that women carry that men don't have to worry about. For women who are worried about or want to get married and start a family, there is, a timeline that they have to be aware of that men don't have to focus on necessarily in the same way. And so in many cases, I do feel that, women sort of have to be aware of certain challenges. And then, of course, the basic thing that in general, most women are, smaller and weaker than men and are more susceptible to violence, especially, sexual violence when it comes to dating. There are vulnerabilities on, women's side that we can't just paper over, right? And say, well, everyone's dating as equals. We should just treat everyone the same. To be fair, to be really just in how we think about sex, we have to think about the truth.
Well, the truth is that in the book you do talk about, we talked about the pill. You talk about how some companies now are actually offering women, one of the compensations is that you can freeze your eggs. And when it comes time for women to date and they have to go through the apps and sometimes the truth does hit them in a way that it goes beyond just a physical act. Are we able to have an honest conversation about how biologically we are different in these times?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think that this conversation is happening and is beginning to happen a little bit more openly. But there are honestly justifiable reasons why it's kind of hard to talk about. You know, especially for feminists, I think that there is this idea, and it's not wrong, that it's already taken us so long to get to the point where, you know, women are seen as, in some sense, equivalent to men, are valued as much as men. And to start talking about how women have particular vulnerabilities or how, you know, women are different might actually set back the movement, might sort of set back that push for equality. But, you know, I think that it's really important to recognize that sameness is not necessarily, you know, you don't have to be the same to be respected and valued as equal human beings, you know, worthy of the same respect. In fact, by, you know, reaching people and talking to people as they are, male, female, non-binary, you're seeing them as a real person and treating them in the way that they need to be treated. And so having this conversation shouldn't be scary, shouldn't be seen as, you know, pushing women backwards, but actually appreciating the fullness of the female experience.
We are two women speaking about this, and I wonder where men fall in this discussion. You write, quote, "The lies that men tell or have been told about themselves are harmful too." What did you mean by that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I wrote this book mainly from the female perspective, you know, because starting, you know, in the Me Too moment, it was women who were having these experiences most often. But in talking to both men and women about sex, I realized, and you begin to realize, that these expectations, you know, hold true for men as well. There's so many men who feel like they can't actually say that they want a relationship, that they, you know, want caring or intimate sexual encounters. It's somehow unmasculine to say that, and so they're hiding, you know, a part of themselves, and that is painful for them. Men are part of the solution as much as, you know, women are, and we have to invite them to the table too.
You also, as part of this new sexual ethic, you also call for more sexual restraint. Does this apply to both sexes?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one thing I talk about in the book is a better sexual ethic that might look something like willing the good of the other. And what that means is, you know, not just getting consent, but thinking before going into a sexual encounter. Is this not just good for me, but also good for my partner? And to be able to understand what's good for your partner, you might have to know something about them. You might have to sort of wait and ask and see what they want. You also have to have taken the time to sort of think about what good sex really means for you and for them. And yes, all of these things take time. It's probably more likely that you would restrain yourself and not have sex with somebody else if you can't figure out what their good is. But I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
So you move to just go to the very beginning of our conversation. It moves from consent, asking a question, to actually listening to what the other person has to say.
Absolutely. Mutuality and sort of mutual respect, real care for the other human being and the other member of this encounter, whether it's for a night or for a whole relationship, is at heart what we should be doing in all of our encounters, not just sex.
In our last 30 seconds, you also write something I just want to throw out there before we leave. You write, "The best sexual world is perhaps a less free one." What did you mean by that?
Absolutely. You know, as we talked about in the beginning of this discussion, right, we have entered into a sort of totally liberated world, and yet so many people seem miserable. I think that actually one of the things that might benefit people is having higher standards, in some ways more rules and understandings for how we behave to each other and even to ourselves. Being able to go into an encounter with, you know, the expectation of safety, of care, would actually heighten the experience for a lot of people.
Christine, congratulations. It is a terrific book. It really made me very uncomfortable, but I think that's how you learn in that moment. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.